What if the person you thought you knew had a life full of sacrifices you never imagined? This funeral changed everything. The crowd at Cypress Grove Cemetery stood solemnly around the freshly dug grave, their quiet murmurs carried away by a gentle breeze. A mix of family, friends, and acquaintances had gathered to pay their respects to Jonathan Spencer, a man revered for his charitable work and warm presence in the community. The polished black headstone gleamed in the afternoon sun, etched with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the mourners, an elderly black woman stood out, though not by intention. Her deep green dress flowed modestly around her, and her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a simple hat. She clutched a single red rose, her hands steady, but her eyes betrayed a weight of emotion far heavier than those around her. While others exchanged pleasantries, few acknowledged her. She remained silent, standing at the edge of the crowd, her presence both commanding and understated. It wasn't until the pastor concluded his final prayer that she stepped forward, slowly making her way to the front. The crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners parted to let her through. When she reached the grave, she paused, looking down at the polished casket. Then, with great care, she placed the rose on top and turned to face the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Jonathan better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Faces turned to one another, brows furrowed, mouths whispered in curiosity. Who was this woman? How could she claim such a deep connection to the man they all thought they knew so well? Eleanor's gaze swept over the sea of faces, her expression calm yet resolute. "Before today ends, you'll understand why I'm here," she said. "And you'll understand the Jonathan Spencer most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise. What Eleanor was about to share would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they'd come to honor. The murmurs had subsided, leaving only the rustle of leaves as Eleanor drew in a deep breath. Her voice carried a calm authority, compelling everyone to listen. "I met Jonathan 50 years ago," she began, her gaze distant as if the memories were playing before her. "It wasn't here in this town. It was in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Eleanor continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "Jonathan was just a young man then, full of fire and ambition. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths, on the steps of a church where we were organizing sit-ins. He wasn't afraid to stand beside me, even when it meant losing his job or facing threats." Gasps rippled through the group. The Jonathan they had known was generous and kind, but none had ever heard of his involvement in such struggles. Eleanor let the weight of her words settle before pressing on. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening. "We were friends, no more than friends. We became each other's family when the world seemed determined to tear us apart. He was there for me when I lost my sister to the violence of those times, and I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being ostracized by his own." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her gaze fixed on the casket. "We shared meals, stories, tears. He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the gravity of her words sinking in. It was hard to reconcile this image of Jonathan with the man they knew, a polished philanthropist who had quietly helped many but never spoke of his own battles. "But," she said, her voice growing firmer, "what I'm telling you isn't just about the past. It's about the man he became because of those struggles." She paused, scanning the crowd, letting the silence stretch just long enough. What Eleanor shared next would go beyond their bond, pulling back the curtain on sacrifices none of them could have imagined. Eleanor's hands clenched tightly around her purse, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "We didn't just survive the times, we fought through them. But that fight demanded sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see." She glanced at the crowd, her piercing eyes meeting theirs as if daring anyone to look away. In 1967, Jonathan lost his job for attending a march in Selma. The school board called it unbecoming conduct. But we all knew what it really was: retribution. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want pity. He packed up what little he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly as she continued. When my own house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was Jonathan who showed up in the middle of the night with his car. He drove me and my two nephews to safety without hesitation, knowing full well the risk. She turned back to the casket, her expression softening. That's who Jonathan was. Not the polished man in the tailored suit most of you remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about. The crowd stood in silence, captivated, as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a letter Jonathan wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part to you." Eleanor unfolded the letter with care, her hands shaking just enough to show how much it meant to her. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling but clear. "Eleanor, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back." Her voice broke on the last line, and she paused to regain her composure. The crowd, previously so stoic, now shifted visibly, some dabbing at their eyes, others staring at the ground in shame for not knowing this side of the man they had come to honor. "Jonathan never turned his back on anyone," Eleanor said, folding the letter again, "not even when it cost him everything. And yet, how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask?" She let the question hang, the weight of her words pressing on the group like a heavy fog. But as the truth of Jonathan's sacrifices sank in, Eleanor revealed something even more profound, an act of courage that would redefine his legacy forever. The air seemed heavier as Eleanor pressed on, her words laced with both sorrow and defiance. "There's one more truth about Jonathan, a truth none of you would have guessed. Yet it's one that shaped everything he stood for." The crowd tensed, hanging on her every word. As she took a steadying breath, Jonathan didn't just fight for others. He fought a battle no one could see. For years, he hid the fact that he was supporting a child, a son he couldn't openly claim because of who the mother was. A collective gasp rippled through the group. Eleanor's eyes swept the stunned faces, but she pressed forward without hesitation. His son, Michael, was born to a woman Jonathan couldn't marry because of the time and place they lived in. The boy was black, like me, and Jonathan was forced to keep it quiet for fear of what it would do to his career and reputation in certain circles. The whispers grew louder now, people exchanging glances of disbelief. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "I was there when Michael was born," she said softly, "and Jonathan made sure that boy never went without. He paid for his schooling, wrote letters every week, and visited whenever he could under the cover of darkness. He made sure Michael had everything he never had growing up, a father's love, even if it had to be a quiet love." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice stayed strong. "And Michael, the man you didn't know existed, is here today." At that, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his presence commanding, with broad shoulders and a quiet dignity in the way he moved. The resemblance to Jonathan was unmistakable. The crowd turned to stare, stunned into silence. Michael walked up to Eleanor and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Eleanor smiled at him through her tears. "It was always my honor." She turned back to the group, addressing them once more. "Jonathan loved all of you in his way, but his truest love was in the people he fought for, those of us who didn't have the luxury of being seen in polite society. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you know the real man behind all the accolades." The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was reflection, a reckoning with the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. But before the mourners could fully process what they'd learned, Eleanor had one final story to share, a moment of bravery that would define Jonathan's legacy forever.